December 17th, 1944. The frozen forests of Belgium echo with the roar of panzer engines as Kampfgruppe Paper, spearhead of Hitler's elite 1st SS Panzer Division, smashes through American defensive lines. Joachim Peiper, commanding 117 tanks and assault guns with nearly 5,000 SS troops, drives deeper into Allied territory than any German force has penetrated on the Western Front since 1940. But this isn't just another battle. This is Hitler's final gamble, his most fanatical warriors unleashed against American forces that include some of the most determined defenders in the European theatre. Within days, the man who will break this offensive, General George S. Patton, will execute one of military history's most audacious maneuvers to save a surrounded American garrison. 3 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had gambled everything on one desperate offensive. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Germany's last major attack of World War II, would either split the Allied forces and change the war's outcome, or destroy the Reich's final reserves. What followed was 6 weeks of the most brutal fighting on the Western Front. War crimes that shocked even hardened veterans. The devastation of several American divisions, and the near collapse of an entire corps. And ultimately, Patton's legendary 90-degree pivot of his entire Third Army to break the siege of Bastogne in one of military history's most remarkable rescue operations. This is the story of when Hitler's elite were finally stopped in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. By late 1944, the Third Reich stood on the precipice of total collapse. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had advanced to the Vistula River and occupied East Prussia, threatening Germany proper for the first time since the war began. In the West, Allied forces had liberated Paris and were pressing against Germany's fortified frontier. The once mighty Wehrmacht was bleeding to death on 2 fronts, losing men and equipment faster than German factories could replace them. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated in his underground bunkers, faced the mathematics of inevitable defeat. Germany controlled less territory than it had since 1939. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow force, incapable of protecting German cities from round-the-clock Allied bombing. Despite record submarine production in 1944, the U-boat arm was a spent force at sea, its crews unable to penetrate Allied convoy defences. But Hitler's mind did not accept defeat. Where his generals saw only mathematical impossibility, the Führer perceived opportunity. The alliance binding Britain, America, and the Soviet Union together was, in his calculation, fundamentally unstable. Churchill and Roosevelt feared Stalin's ambitions as much as they feared German resurgence. A dramatic German victory might shatter this coalition and force the Western powers to seek a separate peace. The question was where to strike. On the Eastern Front, German forces faced overwhelming Soviet superiority in men and material. Stalin commanded over 6 million troops arranged in dense defensive belts that had already absorbed the Wehrmacht's most desperate assaults. An offensive there would achieve nothing but accelerated destruction. The Western Front offered different possibilities. American and British forces, while well-equipped and increasingly confident, were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of front. Their supply lines stretched back through France to the Norman beaches, a logistical vulnerability that German planning could exploit. More importantly, Hitler believed that Western democratic societies lacked the stomach for the massive casualties that Soviet commanders accepted as routine. Hitler's strategic vision crystallized around a single geographic feature, the port of Antwerp. This Belgian harbour had become the primary supply hub for British and American forces advancing toward Germany. Capture Antwerp, and the Allied offensive would collapse from logistical strangulation. Isolate the British Second Army in the Netherlands, and London might recall its forces to defend the home islands. Force the Americans to choose between supporting Britain and confronting Soviet expansion, and the Grand Alliance might fragment entirely. The Ardennes region offered the perfect launching point for such an offensive. Dense forests and broken terrain would neutralize Allied air superiority while concealing German preparations. The area was lightly defended. American commanders considered it a quiet sector, suitable for resting battle-worn divisions and blooding inexperienced units. Most critically, the Ardennes lay directly between the British forces in the north and Patton's aggressive Third Army in the south. A successful breakthrough could split the Allied front in half. Hitler's plan was breathtaking in its audacity. About 30 divisions, nearly 400,000 men, would concentrate for the initial assault, with additional reserves bringing the total force to over 45 divisions as the offensive developed. 3 armies would strike simultaneously across a 100-kilometer front, smashing through American defenses before Allied reserves could respond. The 6th SS Panzer Army, spearheaded by the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, would drive northwest toward Antwerp, while the 5th Panzer Army protected its southern flank. If successful, the offensive would accomplish multiple strategic objectives. German forces would recapture the vital port facilities that sustained Allied operations. British forces in the Netherlands would face encirclement and potential destruction. The psychological shock might convince war-weary populations in Britain and America that victory remained impossibly distant. Most importantly, Stalin's forces would have time to advance deeper into Central Europe, creating the very scenario that Churchill and Roosevelt were determined to prevent. The Führer believed this crisis would force his enemies into negotiations. Britain and America would recognize that continuing the war meant Soviet domination of Europe. Germany could then concentrate its remaining strength against the Red Army, possibly with tacit Western support. Hitler's miracle weapons, jet aircraft and rockets, might yet reverse the war's momentum. This was fantasy dressed as strategy, but Hitler's inner circle dared not voice such thoughts. The plan ignored Germany's crippling fuel shortages, the Wehrmacht's deteriorated training standards, and the Allies' demonstrated ability to recover from tactical defeats. It assumed that democratic governments would abandon their stated war aims at the first sign of serious casualties. Most dangerously, it committed Germany's last strategic reserves to an operation that, if it failed, would leave the Reich defenseless against Soviet attack. But logic had long since ceased to govern German grand strategy. Hitler's will had replaced rational calculation as the basis for military planning. The Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, would proceed regardless of its chances for success. Germany's survival now depended not on sound strategy, but on the fanatical courage of SS Panzer divisions and the winter weather of the Belgian forests. The phone calls came without warning in early December 1944. Germany's senior Western Front commanders, field marshals, generals, and SS leaders who had conquered nations and commanded millions, received identical terse instructions. Report for a conference of utmost importance at a location to be revealed upon arrival. No details. No explanations. Absolute secrecy required. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled from disgrace to command the Western defences, felt the familiar chill of dread as he prepared for the journey. Hitler's summons had become increasingly erratic and threatening as Germany's military situation deteriorated. Recent conferences had devolved into screaming matches where the Führer's rage substituted for strategic thinking. Rundstedt suspected this meeting would prove even more ominous. General Walter Model, the Führer's fireman, who specialized in desperate defensive battles, harbored similar foreboding. His Army Group B held the critical Ardennes sector, and he knew better than anyone how thinly German defenses were stretched. What new impossible mission would Hitler demand from forces that barely existed on paper? On December 11th, the summoned commanders arrived at their destination, the Adlerhorst complex near Ziegenberg. This heavily fortified headquarters, one of Hitler's most secure command bunkers, embodied the paranoid isolation that had consumed the Nazi leadership. Searchlights swept the grounds. Machine gun nests commanded every approach. The generals were subjected to unprecedented security measures, searches, escorts, and constant SS supervision that treated Germany's most senior officers like potential threats. The conference room at Ziegenberg Castle eliminated any remaining dignity. Chairs had been arranged facing a small stage, reducing field marshals to the status of students awaiting a lecture. SS guards positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the room. The atmosphere was one of fear and suspicion. Commanders who had conquered Poland, France, and vast portions of the Soviet Union now sat in uncomfortable silence, wondering what new madness their Führer would propose. Hitler's entrance was carefully orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. His appearance shocked commanders who had not seen him in months. The man who had once mesmerized crowds with his energy now moved hesitantly, his left hand showing a marked tremor consistent with neurological deterioration. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot from endless nights in underground bunkers. But his voice retained its hypnotic power, and his presence still commanded fearful attention. Hitler's presentation was masterful manipulation disguised as strategic briefing. He spoke with the enthusiasm of a theatre director unveiling his greatest production. Maps appeared on easels, showing the proposed breakthrough routes through the Ardennes. Coloured arrows traced the advance of armies toward the Belgian coast. His finger stabbed at Antwerp with religious fervour, as if marking the location of salvation itself. The plan he unveiled was operationally questionable and strategically desperate. Germany's fuel reserves could barely sustain a week of intensive armoured operations. The Wehrmacht's diminished training standards made complex coordinated attacks increasingly unrealistic. Allied air superiority would devastate any large formation operating in daylight. The entire scheme depended on assumptions about enemy behaviour that had no basis in recent experience. But no general dared voice these objections aloud. Hitler's paranoia had reached murderous intensity following the July 20th bomb plot. Officers who questioned his decisions faced courts-martial, imprisonment, or execution. The dictator had convinced himself that his own generals represented a greater threat than Allied armies. In this conference room, survival depended on enthusiastic agreement with whatever fantasies the Führer proposed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who would command the 5th Panzer Army, later recalled the suffocating atmosphere of enforced compliance. Questions were permitted only regarding tactical details, never strategic assumptions. SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, despite his limited military education, nodded sagely as Hitler outlined impossible timetables and unrealistic objectives. The Wehrmacht's professional officer corps had been reduced to implementing a madman's delusions. Thus was born Operation Watch on the Rhine, not from strategic calculation or tactical opportunity, but from fear and institutional paralysis. The conference at Adlerhorst revealed the complete breakdown of rational military planning within the Nazi hierarchy. Germany's last major offensive of World War II emerged from psychological intimidation rather than professional analysis. The Reich's final gamble would be led by commanders who privately understood they were orchestrating their own destruction, but lacked the courage to resist. As the generals departed Ziegenberg, their fate and Germany's were sealed. The Wehrmacht would launch its most desperate attack not because victory was possible, but because opposing Hitler had become impossible. Within days, the consequences of that December conference would unfold in the frozen forests of Belgium, where SS fanatics and American defenders would write the final chapter of the war in the West. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, began its existence not as a military unit, but as a symbol of personal loyalty and Nazi ideology. Founded in 1933 as Hitler's ceremonial bodyguard, the Leibstandarte represented the Führer's vision of a new Germanic warrior elite. The Nazi propaganda machine portrayed these men as examples of racial perfection and ideological purity. Though the reality was more prosaic, they were volunteers, selected primarily for their fanatical devotion to the Nazi cause and their willingness to follow orders without question. By 1944, this ceremonial guard had evolved into one of Germany's most experienced combat formations. The division had fought with distinction and brutality across Poland, France, the Balkans, and the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Gone were the black ceremonial uniforms of the pre-war years. By the Ardennes campaign, SS troops wore field grey combat dress, virtually indistinguishable from regular Wehrmacht units. More importantly for Hitler's purposes, the Leibstandarte remained absolutely loyal to the Nazi regime, even as other German formations showed signs of war weariness and doubt. The transformation from Palace Guard to Panzer Division reflected the broader militarization of Heinrich Himmler's SS empire. What began as a party security force had grown into a parallel army that competed with the traditional Wehrmacht for resources, prestige, and Hitler's favor. By late 1944, the Waffen-SS commanded nearly 40 divisions and over 900,000 men, a force larger than many national armies. While some elite SS formations did receive priority equipment allocations, the organization as a whole struggled with the same shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement personnel that plagued all German forces. The Leibstandarte's reputation for military effectiveness was built on aggressive tactics and high unit cohesion, though this came at a terrible cost in both casualties and moral degradation. In Greece, SS troops had massacred entire villages in reprisal for partisan attacks. On the Eastern Front, the division's advance was marked by systematic execution of Soviet commissars and Jewish civilians. Even in Western Europe, where both Wehrmacht and SS units generally treated Allied prisoners according to international law, the Leibstandarte's conduct remained more brutal than that of regular army formations. At the heart of the Leibstandarte's combat effectiveness lay a cadre of young officers who embodied the Nazi ideal of warrior intellectuals. These men combined traditional Prussian military virtues with revolutionary Nazi ideology, creating a new breed of soldier-politician utterly devoted to Hitler's vision. None exemplified this fusion more completely than SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, who at 29 years old commanded the division's most elite combat formation. Piper's background read like a Nazi recruiting poster. Born in 1915 to a middle-class Prussian family, he had joined the SS at 18 and quickly attracted attention for his intelligence, ruthlessness, and absolute commitment to National Socialist principles. Unlike many SS officers who came from working-class backgrounds, Piper possessed the education and social graces that allowed him to move comfortably in Germany's traditional military elite. More importantly, he demonstrated an intuitive grasp of armoured warfare that marked him as one of Germany's most promising young commanders. Piper's tactical brilliance had been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front. During the initial invasion of the Soviet Union, His battalion had spearheaded the Leibstandartes advance toward Moscow, covering hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. His ability to coordinate complex armored assaults while maintaining the aggressive tempo that blitzkrieg warfare demanded had earned him rapid promotion and Hitler's personal attention. By 1943, Peiper commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, a combined arms formation that served as the Leibstandartes' primary striking force. The equipment assigned to Peiper's command for the Ardennes offensive represented a mix of Germany's finest and most problematic armoured vehicles. His Kampfgruppe included approximately 117 tanks and assault guns built around 45 reliable Panther medium tanks and 37 Panzer IV medium tanks that formed the backbone of his armoured strength. Supporting these were elements of the division's heavy tank battalion, equipped with the massive Tiger II tanks that had become symbols of German technological ambition. However, only about 17 of these 70-ton monsters were operational, and their mechanical complexity made them as dangerous to their crews as to enemy forces. The Panther tanks represented the most effective component of Peiper's armour. These vehicles combined the mobility necessary for breakthrough operations with armour protection that rivaled much heavier designs. Their 75mm guns could penetrate the frontal armour of any Allied tank, while their sophisticated fire control systems gave German crews a decisive advantage in long-range gunnery duels. Perhaps most importantly, the Panther's mechanical reliability had improved dramatically since its disastrous debut at Kursk in 1943. The infantry component of Peiper's force reflected both German innovation and growing desperation. SS Panzergrenadiers carried the revolutionary Sate G44 assault rifle, the world's first practical automatic rifle that would influence small arms design for decades to come. Their half-track vehicles mounted 20mm anti-aircraft guns that could devastate Allied fighter bombers attempting close air support. Supporting artillery included the dreaded Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, whose distinctive shrieking projectiles earned them the nickname "Screaming Mimes" among Allied troops. Hitler's decision to entrust the Ardennes offensive's critical northern thrust to the Waffen-SS reflected both practical and ideological considerations. From a military standpoint, elite SS Panzer divisions, like the Leibstandarte, retained the aggressive spirit and unit cohesion that had characterized German forces in the war's early years, but was increasingly absent from ordinary Wehrmacht formations. Their officers were younger and more willing to take risks, though this aggressiveness sometimes led to unnecessary casualties and poor logistical management that conservative Wehrmacht commanders avoided. More importantly, SS formations retained the fanatical élan necessary for operations that rational military analysis would consider impossible. The ideological dimension was equally important. Hitler viewed the Ardennes offensive as more than a military operation. It was a test of National Socialist will against Western decadence. Only units that fully embodied Nazi ideology could be trusted with such a momentous mission. The SS, as the party's armed wing, represented the purest expression of Hitler's revolutionary vision. If Germany's advanced weapons could not yet turn the tide of war, perhaps the superior fighting spirit that Nazi propaganda claimed for the master race could achieve what technology and numbers could not. This fusion of military effectiveness and ideological commitment made the 1st SS Panzer Division a formidable but ultimately flawed instrument for Hitler's desperate gamble. The Leibstandartes troops believed they were fighting not merely for territory or tactical advantage, but for the survival of their entire worldview. This sense of existential struggle would drive them to extraordinary feats of courage and equally extraordinary acts of savagery in the frozen forests of Belgium. As Peiper's men prepared their vehicles and weapons for the coming offensive, They represented both the pinnacle of German military evolution and its ultimate corruption. These were experienced soldiers, equipped with advanced weapons and led by officers of undeniable tactical skill. They were also fanatics, who had been conditioned to view their enemies as subhuman and to treat civilian populations as expendable obstacles to German victory. The collision between this elite force and American defenders would test not only military capabilities, but the moral foundations of warfare itself. In stark contrast to the elite SS formations preparing for their grand offensive, American forces in the Ardennes sector presented a picture of dangerous vulnerability masked by overconfidence. 7 divisions held the critical 80-kilometre front, stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, but several were severely under strength, recently arrived, or recovering from previous battles. This deployment reflected fundamental Allied assumptions about German capabilities that would prove catastrophically wrong. The 99th Infantry Division, holding the northern shoulder of what would become the main German assault, epitomized the American Army's growing pains in late 1944. Activated only 2 years earlier, the division had arrived in Europe just 3 months before the German offensive. Its soldiers were young, well-equipped, and eager, but they lacked the combat experience that distinguished veteran formations from green troops destined for slaughter. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger, never seen a friend die violently, never faced the psychological trauma that separated military training from military reality. Alongside the inexperienced 99th stood the veteran 2nd Infantry Division, a formation that had seen heavy fighting since Normandy, but was currently engaged in its own limited offensive operations. The 106th Infantry Division, even newer than the 99th, held positions in the Schnee-Eifel region, with 2 of its regiments dangerously exposed in a forward salient. The 28th Infantry Division, bloodied in the recent Hürtgen Forest battles, was supposedly resting in the Ardennes, while still holding frontline positions. Only the 4th Infantry Division, veterans of Utah Beach and the subsequent campaign across France, possessed both experience and reasonable combat strength. The division deployment reflected American commanders' fundamental misunderstanding of the sector's strategic importance. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the 1st Army, viewed the Ardennes as an ideal location for blooding inexperienced units, while allowing battle-worn divisions to rest and refit. The heavily forested terrain seemed to preclude large-scale armoured operations, making it unsuitable for German offensive action. Intelligence estimates suggested that enemy forces opposite the American lines consisted primarily of second-rate Volksgrenadier units and static defensive formations, incapable of sustained attack. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable given the available evidence. German radio traffic in the sector remained minimal, suggesting low-level activity consistent with a quiet front. Aerial reconnaissance detected no significant concentrations of armour or artillery behind enemy lines. Captured prisoners belonged to units that Allied intelligence had correctly identified as defensive formations of limited combat value. What American commanders failed to recognize was that the Wehrmacht's deception operations had achieved near-perfect success in concealing the massive build-up occurring beyond the reach of Allied surveillance. The Ardennes terrain itself posed challenges that both sides understood differently. American planners saw dense forests, steep ridges, and narrow roads as obstacles that would prevent large-scale German operations. German commanders, drawing on their experience in similar terrain during the 1940 campaign in France, recognized that the same features could provide concealment and surprise that would offset Allied advantages in air power and artillery. The critical difference lay in offensive versus defensive thinking. Americans assumed the terrain favored defenders, while Germans planned to use it to achieve surprise. American defensive preparations reflected the sector's low priority in Allied planning, though they were not entirely negligent. Most positions consisted of individual foxholes and small strongpoints, rather than the elaborate defensive systems that characterized more active sectors. Anti-tank obstacles were minimal, a few roadblocks and scattered minefields that could delay but not stop determined armored attack. Artillery support was adequate for normal defensive operations, and the American artillery system's flexibility and firepower would prove crucial once commanders recognized the scope of the German offensive. Reserve formations were thin, but not entirely absent. The 7th Armored Division was positioned behind the northern sector, while elements of the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions could provide support to threatened areas. However, these reserves were committed to other operations or scattered across wide areas, meaning that concentrated response to German breakthrough would require precious time that frontline defenders might not have. Corps and Army artillery units possessed the firepower to devastate attacking formations, but only if they could be coordinated effectively and supplied with adequate ammunition. The communication systems linking American units reflected peacetime assumptions about battlefield management. Radio networks were designed for coordination rather than emergency response, lacking the redundancy necessary to maintain command and control under intense enemy pressure. Telephone lines, strung through forests that German artillery would soon turn into killing zones, provided the primary means of communication between frontline units and higher headquarters. When these systems failed, as they inevitably would under bombardment, American commanders would find themselves isolated and unable to coordinate effective responses to German attacks. Intelligence failures compounded the physical weaknesses of American deployment. Ultra-intercepts, the product of British code-breaking efforts that had provided crucial intelligence throughout the war, offered few clues about German intentions in the Ardennes. Wehrmacht commanders had maintained strict radio silence regarding the offensive, relying instead on courier systems and landline communications that Allied intelligence could not penetrate. Even more frustrating, German deception operations had successfully convinced Allied analysts that any activity in the sector represented defensive preparations rather than offensive buildup. The psychological state of American forces reflected broader tensions within the Allied coalition in late 1944. Victory seemed certain but frustratingly distant, creating a dangerous combination of overconfidence and war weariness among troops who had been fighting for months without decisive results. The approaching Christmas season heightened soldiers' desire to believe that major combat operations were winding down for the winter. This mindset, while understandable given the circumstances, left American forces psychologically unprepared for the shock of major German attack. 150 kilometers to the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army presented a stark contrast to the defensive mentality pervading the Ardennes sector. Patton's forces were engaged in aggressive operations against the Siegfried Line, attempting to break through German border defences and advance into the industrial Saar region. The Third Army's 3 corps controlled 9 divisions of seasoned troops accustomed to offensive operations and rapid movement. These formations possessed the experience, equipment, and leadership necessary for mobile warfare, but their current missions kept them far from the developing crisis in Belgium. Patton himself embodied the aggressive spirit that had carried Allied forces from Normandy to the German frontier. His reputation for rapid advances and audacious manoeuvres was matched by an almost supernatural ability to sense enemy intentions and respond accordingly. Crucially, Patton had already begun developing contingency plans for a northward movement before the German offensive began, recognizing that enemy activity in the Ardennes might require rapid response from his forces. This foresight would prove crucial when crisis demanded immediate action rather than careful planning. The logistical situation confronting all Allied forces in the region reflected the rapid pace of the advance from Normandy. Supply lines stretched over 500 kilometers from the invasion beaches to the front lines, creating bottlenecks that limited offensive operations and left little margin for emergency resupply. Ammunition stocks, while adequate for normal operations, could not sustain the intensive fighting that major German attack would require. Most critically, fuel reserves were insufficient to support large-scale armoured movements, meaning that rapid response to enemy breakthrough would require careful coordination and priority allocation. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. December 1944 brought unusually severe winter weather to Western Europe, with heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and persistent cloud cover that grounded Allied air forces for days at a time. These conditions favoured defensive operations and limited the mobility that constituted the American Army's primary advantage over German forces. More ominously, the weather provided exactly the concealment that German planners needed to move large formations without detection by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. As December 16th approached, American forces in the Ardennes presented a vulnerable but not helpless target for German offensive action. Inexperienced and battle-worn troops, holding an extended front with limited reserves, faced the elite of the German army without recognizing the immediate danger. Intelligence failures had blinded Allied commanders to enemy intentions, while psychological factors had created dangerous overconfidence among troops who believed major fighting was behind them. However, the inherent strengths of American artillery, logistics, and command flexibility would prove decisive once the shock of initial attack was absorbed and overcome. The stage was set for a dramatic test of military effectiveness, the collision between German desperation and American resilience that would significantly prolong the war and demonstrate the ultimate limits of elite formations operating without strategic superiority. At 5:30 in the morning, on December 16th, 1944, the darkness over the Ardennes erupted in fire. 1,500 German artillery pieces, the largest concentration of guns assembled on the Western Front since 1940, opened fire simultaneously across a front stretching from Monschau to Echternach. The barrage shattered the winter silence with a thunderous roar that could be heard 50 kilometers away, announcing to the world that Germany was far from finished. The artillery preparation represented a masterpiece of coordination and deception. For weeks, German engineers had positioned guns under cover of darkness, moving pieces into carefully camouflaged positions during the brief December nights. Heavy howitzers, mortars, and the dreaded Nebelwerfer rocket launchers contributed their distinctive shrieking projectiles to the devastating chorus. The screaming Mimes, as American troops would learn to call them, added a psychological dimension to the physical destruction, as their characteristic wailing sound terrorized defenders even before the explosions arrived. The bombardment targeted not just front-line positions, but the entire infrastructure of American defense. Communication centers, supply depots, road junctions, and artillery positions all received concentrated attention from German gunners who had spent months studying their targets. Telephone lines snapped under the concussion, radio antennas toppled, and command posts collapsed as the Wehrmacht demonstrated that it retained the ability to mass firepower effectively. Within minutes, American units found themselves isolated from higher headquarters and unable to coordinate responses to the developing crisis. In the foxholes and bunkers scattered throughout the frozen forest, American soldiers experienced their introduction to modern warfare's most terrifying aspect. Men who had trained for combat, but never experienced its reality, discovered that no amount of preparation could adequately prepare them for the psychological shock of intensive bombardment. The earth heaved and shook as heavy shells exploded in the frozen ground, sending geysers of dirt, snow, and shattered trees high into the air. Soldiers pressed themselves into the bottom of their foxholes, praying that the next explosion would not land directly on their position. The forest itself became a weapon against the defenders. German artillery had been carefully calibrated to explode shells in the treetops, creating deadly airbursts that showered the forest floor with wooden splinters and metal fragments. Ancient trees, some over a century old, toppled across roads and trails, creating obstacles that would prove crucial in the coming battle. The familiar landscape of the quiet sector was transformed into an alien hellscape of smoke, fire, and destruction. As the artillery barrage continued, cities throughout Belgium and the Netherlands felt the broader impact of Germany's renewed aggression. Antwerp and Liège, which had been experiencing intermittent V-weapon attacks for weeks, continued to suffer from the long-range bombardment that demonstrated German capability to strike far behind the front lines. These attacks, while not coordinated with the morning's artillery barrage, reminded Allied commanders that German technology could still reach targets that conventional forces could not threaten. The port facilities of Antwerp, crucial to Allied logistics, remained vulnerable to weapons that the Allies could neither intercept nor effectively counter. The psychological impact of the continuing missile attacks extended far beyond their immediate military effect. Allied commanders had grown accustomed to fighting an enemy whose technological capabilities seemed increasingly primitive compared to Allied production. The V-weapons reminded them that German engineering could still produce innovations that challenged Allied assumptions about technological superiority. More importantly, the attacks demonstrated German intelligence about Allied supply systems and their vulnerability to long-range precision strikes. As dawn broke over the Ardennes, the weather conditions that German planners had counted on proved even more favourable than anticipated. Heavy cloud cover and intermittent snow grounded most Allied aircraft, leaving German ground forces free to manoeuvre without the devastating air attacks that had characterized previous battles. The low-hanging clouds that blanketed the battlefield created an eerie twilight atmosphere that lasted well into the morning hours. German forces, equipped with white winter camouflage and trained for operations in poor visibility, used these conditions to maximum advantage. The signal for the ground assault came not from dramatic innovations, but from the methodical precision that characterized German military planning. Across the entire front, German infantry emerged from their concealed positions and began advancing through the shattered forest toward American lines. Volksgrenadier divisions, reinforced with assault guns and supported by concentrated artillery fire, moved forward with a determination that surprised Allied observers who had assumed German morale was broken. These were not the elite SS formations that would spearhead the main attacks, but ordinary German soldiers fighting with the desperation of men who knew their nation's survival was at stake. The first contacts between German and American forces revealed the stark contrast in preparation and expectation. American sentries, many of whom were experiencing combat for the first time, found themselves facing determined attacks by troops who seemed to emerge from the winter landscape like ghosts. German soldiers, camouflaged in white winter clothing and armed with automatic weapons, advanced with the methodical precision of troops who had rehearsed their assault for weeks. The initial exchanges were brief and decisive. Surprised American positions were overwhelmed before defenders could organize effective resistance. Communications failures compounded the tactical surprise achieved by German forces. Artillery had severed most telephone lines connecting frontline units to higher headquarters, while radio communications were disrupted by atmospheric conditions and the confusion of battle. American commanders found themselves fighting blind, unable to determine the scope of the German attack or coordinate appropriate responses. Individual units were forced to make decisions based on limited local information, leading to a fragmented defense that German planners had anticipated and prepared to exploit. The effectiveness of German deception operations became apparent as the morning progressed. American intelligence had detected virtually no advance warning of the massive buildup that had occurred behind German lines. Radio silence, movement during hours of darkness, and careful camouflage had concealed preparations that involved hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of vehicles. The success of these concealment efforts demonstrated that the Wehrmacht retained the capability for large-scale operations despite its deteriorating strategic position. By mid-morning, the pattern of German success was becoming clear to Allied intelligence analysts studying fragmentary reports from the front. This was not a limited spoiling attack or a diversionary operation, but a full-scale offensive aimed at achieving strategic objectives. The coordination between artillery, supporting attacks, and ground forces demonstrated planning and preparation that contradicted Allied assumptions about German capabilities. Most ominously, the attacks were concentrated in areas that offered direct routes to major Allied supply bases and communication centres. As December 16th drew to a close, the magnitude of the German achievement was becoming apparent to commanders on both sides. Operation Watch on the Rhine had achieved complete tactical surprise and was already threatening to become something more significant than a mere spoiling attack. American forces were in retreat across multiple sectors, German armour was beginning to exploit gaps in the front lines, and Allied reserves were too distant or too committed to other operations to provide immediate assistance. The earth had indeed shaken, and the tremors would be felt across the Western Front for weeks to come. While conventional German forces pressed their attacks across the entire Ardennes front, the spearhead of the offensive was advancing with the methodical precision that had made Joachim Peiper's name synonymous with armoured breakthrough. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the elite formation built around the 1st SS Panzer Division's finest troops, had begun its advance before dawn on December 16th, with orders that reflected both Hitler's strategic ambitions and the Wehrmacht's desperate situation. Reach the Meuse River within 24 hours, secure the vital bridges, and open the route to Antwerp for the follow-on forces. The initial phase of Peiper's advance proceeded with textbook efficiency. His column, approximately 117 tanks and assault guns, supported by nearly 4,800 troops in half-tracks and trucks, moved through the pre-dawn darkness along carefully reconnoitred routes that avoided major American strongpoints. The armoured strength consisted primarily of 45 reliable Panther medium tanks and 37 Panzer IV medium tanks, supplemented by only 17 operational Tiger, 2 heavy tanks from the division's heavy battalion. German intelligence had identified weak points in the American line, where inexperienced troops held overstretched positions, and Peiper's advance guard struck these vulnerable sectors with overwhelming force. The first significant resistance came from elements of the 99th Infantry Division near Lanzerath, where a single American reconnaissance platoon attempted to delay the German advance. The 18 men of Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, led by Lieutenant Lyle Buch, occupied positions that commanded the approaches to a vital road junction. For several hours, this tiny force held up an entire German division, inflicting casualties and delays that would have strategic consequences for the entire offensive. Their heroic stand demonstrated that American soldiers, despite their inexperience, possessed the courage and determination necessary to fight against overwhelming odds. When German forces finally overwhelmed the Lanzerath position, Paper's column resumed its advance with characteristic ruthlessness. The narrow forest roads that had seemed adequate for German planning purposes quickly became bottlenecks as tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles competed for space on routes designed for civilian traffic. German military police attempted to maintain order, but the pressure to maintain schedule and exploit success created confusion that threatened to derail the entire operation. Paper, monitoring the situation from his command vehicle, realized that conventional traffic control measures would be insufficient. The traffic crisis deepened when elements of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, advancing on parallel routes, converged with Piper's column at a critical road junction. Hundreds of vehicles were soon jammed into a space barely adequate for normal traffic, creating a target that Allied air power could have devastated had weather conditions permitted flying. German officers argued over priorities, while precious hours slipped away, and the carefully planned timetable fell further behind schedule. The situation demanded decisive action from a commander willing to sacrifice cooperation for speed. Piper's solution demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his complete disregard for anything that interfered with his mission. Rather than negotiate with the Volksgrenadier commanders or wait for military police to sort out the traffic jam, he simply ordered his tanks to push through the obstruction, regardless of damage to other German vehicles. Panzer IV and Panther tanks rammed lighter vehicles out of the way, crushing some and pushing others into roadside ditches. The aggressive maneuver cleared the road, but left dozens of damaged German vehicles in its wake and created lasting resentment among Wehrmacht units that would affect cooperation throughout the campaign. Free of the traffic jam, Piper's column continued its advance toward objectives that seemed tantalizingly close on the map, but frustratingly distant in reality. The roads that had appeared adequate for rapid movement during the planning phase proved inadequate for sustained traffic by heavy armoured vehicles. Bridges, designed for civilian use, required careful negotiation by 70-ton Tiger tanks, while narrow passages through villages forced the column to proceed in single file at vulnerable speeds. Each delay accumulated into larger problems that threatened the entire operation's success. American engineers, following established defensive doctrine, had prepared numerous obstacles along the most likely German approach routes. Bridges were prepared for demolition, road junctions were blocked with felled trees, and key passages were obstructed with abandoned vehicles and debris. While these obstacles were not sufficient to stop determined German attack, they imposed cumulative delays that disrupted the precise timing on which German success depended. Paper's engineers worked frantically to clear passages, while his main force waited impatiently for permission to resume the advance. By noon on December 16th, Piper's spearhead had penetrated deeper into American territory than any German force since 1940. His advance had covered nearly 20 kilometers and was approaching the vital crossroads town of Malmedy, where control of the road network would determine whether the offensive could maintain its ambitious schedule. Behind him, a trail of destroyed American vehicles and equipment marked the path of his advance, while ahead lay the prize that would make his reputation as one of the war's most audacious commanders. The arrival of elements from the 3rd Parachute Division provided Piper with unexpected reinforcement at a crucial moment. These elite airborne troops, moving as regular infantry rather than conducting parachute operations, had been assigned to support the main offensive through conventional ground operations. Rather than continue their independent mission, the paratrooper officers requested permission to join Piper's advance, recognizing that his column offered the best chance of achieving significant results. The combination of experienced tank crews and elite infantry would prove formidable in the close-quarters combat that characterized fighting in the Ardennes forests. The capture of Buchholz demonstrated Paper's psychological understanding of American forces as much as his tactical skill. Rather than conduct a time-consuming assault on the town's defenses, he deployed his tanks in positions that dominated all escape routes and then demanded immediate surrender. The American garrison, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of German armor and lacking communications with higher headquarters, capitulated without significant resistance. This bloodless victory provided Paper with additional prisoners and, more importantly, intelligence about American dispositions and defensive plans. The most significant prize of the day came with the capture of an American fuel depot at Bullingen Airfield. This facility, established to support Allied fighter operations, contained thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline that German forces desperately needed. Piper's advance had already consumed more fuel than planned, and his supply lines were increasingly vulnerable to American counterattack. The captured fuel would allow his column to continue its advance toward the Meuse without waiting for German supply vehicles to negotiate the congested roads behind the front lines. The fueling operation revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Piper's command style. His aggressive pursuit of objectives had achieved remarkable success in terms of distance covered and enemy resistance overcome. However, his willingness to operate independently of supporting units and ignore conventional supply procedures had left his force increasingly isolated from the main German offensive. As evening approached on December 16th, Kampfgruppe Piper was achieving tactical success but creating strategic problems that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The day's advance had demonstrated that German armor, properly led and adequately supplied, could still achieve the breakthrough results that had characterized blitzkrieg warfare in its heyday. American forces, despite their material advantages and potential air superiority, remained vulnerable to determined assault by elite formations operating with tactical surprise. However, the problems Piper encountered, traffic congestion, supply difficulties, and the need to operate independently of supporting units, foreshadowed the larger challenges that would doom the Ardennes offensive. Success was possible, but only at a price that Germany could not afford to pay. While Piper's panzers smashed through American defensive lines with conventional military force, a more sinister and psychologically devastating operation was unfolding throughout the Allied rear areas. Operation Greif, masterminded by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, represented the Wehrmacht's most ambitious attempt at psychological warfare during the entire war. This deception operation would prove that sometimes the threat of sabotage could be more effective than sabotage itself, paralyzing Allied decision-making at the precise moment when rapid response was most crucial. Skorzeny had earned his reputation as Nazi Germany's most daring special operations commander through a series of spectacular missions that read like adventure novels. His rescue of Mussolini from Allied captivity in 1943 had made him Hitler's favorite commando leader and earned him a personal audience with the Führer. When Hitler conceived the Ardennes offensive, he turned to Skorzeny to provide the unconventional elements that might give German forces the psychological edge necessary for success. The mission assigned to Operation Greif was both simple and impossibly complex: sow chaos behind Allied lines and disrupt command communications at the critical moment of German breakthrough. The 150th Panzer Brigade, the unit created specifically for Operation Greif, represented one of the war's most unusual military formations. Approximately 2,000 men had been selected from volunteers throughout the German armed forces, chosen primarily for their willingness to undertake extremely dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Finding personnel with adequate English language skills proved far more difficult than German planners had anticipated, and most of the volunteers possessed only rudimentary knowledge of American customs and language. This linguistic limitation would severely constrain the operation's effectiveness and force Skorzeny to rely more on confusion and psychological impact than on sophisticated impersonation. The equipment assembled for Operation Greif demonstrated both German ingenuity and the desperate expedients that characterized the Reich's war effort in late 1944. Captured American uniforms had been collected from prisoner-of-war camps and battlefield salvage operations, then carefully altered to fit German personnel. American weapons, vehicles, and equipment had been captured during previous battles and stockpiled for this operation. Most challenging was the need for Allied armoured vehicles, which German workshops addressed by modifying Panther tanks with sheet metal additions to resemble American M10 tank destroyers rather than attempting to obtain actual captured Shermans. The legal and moral implications of Operation Greif troubled even some German officers who were willing to accept the harsh realities of total war. The Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited the use of enemy uniforms in combat operations, and captured personnel could expect execution as spies rather than treatment as prisoners of war. Skorzeny addressed these concerns with characteristic cynicism, arguing that conventional military law had become irrelevant in a struggle for national survival. His volunteers understood the risks they were accepting, though many underestimated the likelihood of capture and execution. The infiltration began during the early hours of December 16th, coinciding with the main German offensive, but operating according to entirely different principles. Small teams of disguised German soldiers, traveling in captured American jeeps and trucks, passed through the confusion of the front lines and began moving toward their assigned targets. Their missions varied from specific sabotage objectives to general disruption of Allied communications and transportation. Most importantly, they had been instructed to spread rumors and disinformation that would amplify the psychological impact of their presence far beyond what their limited numbers could actually accomplish. The initial attempts at infiltration revealed both the potential and limitations of Skorzeny's concept. German commandos managed to redirect some American supply columns by changing road signs and placing fake detour markers. They created confusion by abandoning vehicles at strategic choke points and spreading false reports of massive German breakthrough operations. However, their poor English and unfamiliarity with American military procedures made close contact with Allied personnel extremely dangerous, forcing most teams to operate at a distance from their intended targets. The psychological warfare aspect of Operation Greif proved more devastating than any conventional sabotage could have achieved. Within hours of the first infiltrations, Allied military police were stopping every vehicle and interrogating every soldier whose identity seemed questionable. American troops found themselves subjected to quizzes about baseball scores, movie stars, and regional slang that would have challenged many genuine Americans. The atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that resulted from these security measures disrupted Allied operations far more effectively than direct German attack could have accomplished. The most spectacular success of the entire operation came not from any specific sabotage action, but from a calculated piece of disinformation that reached the highest levels of Allied command. Skorzeny's teams had been instructed to spread rumors that German commandos were planning to assassinate General Eisenhower and other senior Allied leaders. This information, passed through multiple channels and carefully designed to seem credible, eventually reached Eisenhower's security staff in Paris. The Supreme Allied Commander found himself confined to his headquarters under heavy guard at precisely the moment when his personal intervention might have been most valuable in coordinating Allied response to the German offensive. The irony of Eisenhower's situation captured the essence of psychological warfare's effectiveness. The general who commanded millions of troops and controlled the fate of Western Europe was rendered powerless by fears of a threat that existed primarily in German propaganda rather than military reality. For 10 days, Allied Supreme Command operated under siege conditions, while Scorzeni's non-existent assassination teams supposedly roamed the streets of Paris. The disruption to Allied decision-making processes provided German forces with precisely the kind of advantage that conventional military operations could never have achieved. The fate of Scorzeni's commandos revealed both the audacity and ultimate futility of unconventional warfare conducted without adequate preparation. Most teams were captured within days of beginning their missions. Their inadequate language skills and unfamiliarity with American procedures making detection inevitable. Only a few teams accomplished significant sabotage objectives, and fewer still managed to return to German lines with valuable intelligence. 8 German soldiers were eventually executed as spies, paying the ultimate price for their participation in operations that violated international law while achieving limited tactical results. The long-term impact of Operation Greif extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. Allied forces would remain suspicious of potential infiltrators for the remainder of the war, implementing security procedures that slowed military operations and consumed valuable resources. More significantly, the operation demonstrated that psychological warfare could multiply the effectiveness of conventional military forces when employed with imagination and audacity. However, the operation also revealed the limitations of such tactics when not supported by adequate resources, training, and realistic objectives. As the initial phase of the Ardennes offensive drew to a close, Operation Greif had accomplished some of its primary objectives while revealing the vulnerabilities that characterized military organizations operating under extreme stress. Fear and uncertainty had proven temporarily effective in disrupting Allied operations, but the inherent weaknesses of the German approach, inadequate preparation, unrealistic expectations, and insufficient resources, would ultimately limit its impact. The lesson would influence future military planning, but for now it served German purposes by creating the chaos and confusion that allowed conventional forces to exploit their initial breakthrough. The storm that had broken over the Ardennes included elements that no amount of material preparation could have anticipated or countered, but also revealed the limits of improvisation in modern warfare. December 17th, 1944, dawned cold and overcast as Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its relentless advance toward the Meuse River. The previous day's successes had filled German ranks with confidence that the breakthrough might actually succeed, but the euphoria of victory would soon be stained by an act of brutality that would define the moral character of the entire Ardennes campaign. What happened in a snow-covered field near the Belgian crossroads town of Malmedy would shock even veteran soldiers accustomed to the harsh realities of modern warfare. The encounter began as a routine meeting engagement between advancing German forces and retreating American units. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, commanded by Captain John W. Horn, was withdrawing southward along the Malmedy-Saint-Vith road when they encountered the lead elements of Peiper's column near the village of Borgnez. The 33 vehicles, carrying 140 American soldiers, represented exactly the kind of target that German commanders had been trained to exploit: isolated, lightly armed, and unable to offer effective resistance to armoured attack. The initial contact proceeded according to established military convention. German tanks quickly surrounded the American convoy, making escape impossible and resistance futile. Captain Horn, recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, ordered his men to surrender rather than sacrifice their lives in a pointless gesture. 84 American soldiers climbed out of their vehicles with hands raised, expecting to be processed as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention that both sides had pledged to observe. What followed would violate every principle of civilized warfare and haunt the memories of survivors for the rest of their lives. The German soldiers who accepted the American surrender belonged to the 1st SS Panzer Division, elite troops who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology that portrayed their enemies as racially inferior and unworthy of mercy. While Joachim Peiper himself was not present at the scene, the men under his command had absorbed his philosophy that speed and ruthlessness were more important than adherence to international law. The Americans were herded into a field beside the road, where they stood in small groups, uncertain about their fate, but still believing that their status as prisoners would protect them from harm. What happened next remains one of the most controversial and heavily investigated incidents of the Battle of the Bulge. Survivor testimony varies about whether the shooting began as a result of panic, misunderstanding, or deliberate execution order. Some witnesses reported hearing a pistol shot from a German officer, followed immediately by machine gun fire from multiple positions. Others described what seemed like sudden, chaotic shooting that may have begun when one prisoner attempted to escape. Regardless of how it began, the result was the systematic killing of defenseless men who had surrendered in good faith. Men who had surrendered believing in the protection of international law were cut down where they stood, their bodies falling into the snow that would preserve the evidence of this war crime for investigators who would arrive weeks later. Some Americans attempted to flee toward nearby woods, but German soldiers pursued them and shot them down. The killing continued for several minutes as German troops moved among the wounded, though survivor accounts differ about the extent and systematic nature of this final phase. However, the German execution was not as thorough as intended. Several American soldiers, though wounded, managed to survive by feigning death among the corpses of their comrades. Private First Class Warren Schmidt lay motionless beneath the body of his sergeant, feeling warm blood seeping through his uniform while German boots walked within inches of his head. Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens, shot in the back but still conscious, remained perfectly still for over an hour while German soldiers continued to patrol the area. The survival of these witnesses proved crucial to documenting the atrocity and ensuring that those responsible would eventually face justice. As darkness fell and German forces moved on toward their primary objectives, the survivors began the desperate process of escape and evasion. Some, like Private Schmidt, crawled for hours through the frozen forest before reaching American lines. Others, including Sergeant Ahrens, were discovered by Belgian civilians who risked their own lives to provide medical care and shelter. The first reports of the massacre reached American headquarters within hours of the event, but the full scope of the atrocity was not immediately understood. Initial radio transmissions spoke of heavy casualties and possible war crimes, but communication difficulties prevented detailed investigation until the following day. When American forces finally reached the massacre site, they discovered a scene that exceeded their worst fears. Dozens of frozen corpses scattered across the snow, many showing evidence of wounds inflicted at close range. Evidence of looting was discovered at the scene, though accounts vary about its extent and systematic nature. Some bodies had been searched, and personal effects scattered in the snow, while others remained undisturbed. Watches, wallets, and other valuables were missing from some victims, though whether this represented organized plunder or individual opportunism remained unclear. The physical evidence would prove crucial in the war crimes trials that followed the war's end. The news of Malmedy spread through American ranks with the speed of wildfire, transforming the psychological atmosphere of the entire Ardennes campaign. Soldiers who had viewed their German opponents as professional military men operating under the same rules of warfare now understood that they faced enemies who had abandoned all pretense of civilized conduct. The massacre validated every propaganda claim about Nazi brutality and eliminated any sympathy for German forces that might have existed among American troops. More importantly, it convinced American soldiers that surrender was not an option when facing SS troops. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. American commanders began issuing informal guidance that prisoners from SS units should be treated with extreme caution, while individual soldiers made private vows to avenge their murdered comrades. The news reached American newspapers within days, where it was presented as evidence of German barbarism and justification for any measures necessary to achieve victory. Public opinion, already hardening against Germany, became even more determined to achieve unconditional surrender regardless of the cost. The tactical consequences of Malmedy were equally significant. American units that might have surrendered when surrounded now fought to the last man, knowing that capture could mean execution rather than imprisonment. This resistance prolonged battles and inflicted additional casualties on German forces that could not afford the losses. More importantly, it demonstrated to American soldiers that they were fighting not just for territory or political objectives, but for the fundamental principles of civilization itself. The legal ramifications of the massacre would not be fully addressed until after the war's end, when Allied tribunals prosecuted German officers for war crimes committed in the Ardennes. However, the immediate impact was to strip away any remaining illusions about the nature of the conflict. American forces had entered the Ardennes, expecting a conventional military campaign governed by established rules of warfare. The massacre at Malmedy revealed that they faced an enemy that had systematically abandoned those rules in pursuit of victory at any cost. The blood spilled in that Belgian field on December 17th would stain the snow for weeks to come, serving as a constant reminder of the moral stakes involved in the battle for the Ardennes. What had begun as a strategic gamble to split the Allied coalition had become something far more sinister, a test of whether civilized values could survive the ultimate extremes of total war. The answer to that question would be written in the actions of soldiers on both sides during the brutal weeks that followed. The massacre at Malmedy was merely the bloodiest incident in a campaign of systematic destruction that Kampfgruppe Peiper carved across the Belgian countryside. As Joachim Peiper's column resumed its advance toward the Meuse River, it left behind a trail of devastation that would haunt the memories of survivors for decades to come. The SS commander's obsession with maintaining speed and momentum had transformed his force into an instrument of terror that recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians, legitimate military targets, and innocent bystanders. The savage fighting involving the 99th Infantry Division began in earnest during the afternoon of December 17th, as German forces exploited the gaps torn in American lines by the previous day's assault. This inexperienced formation, which had arrived in Europe only 3 months earlier, found itself facing the full weight of Germany's most elite armoured formation without adequate support or preparation. While the division would suffer devastating casualties and lose significant ground, its stubborn resistance would ultimately play a crucial role in preventing German forces from achieving their strategic objectives. The village of Honsfeld became the first major population centre to experience the full fury of Peiper's advance. American defenders, primarily from the 394th Infantry Regiment, had established defensive positions around the village's church and main crossroads, believing that the natural obstacles of the surrounding terrain would channel German attacks into predictable killing zones. They failed to account for the psychological impact of facing SS troops, who had been conditioned to view mercy as weakness and civilians as legitimate targets. The assault on Honsfeld demonstrated the tactical evolution that had transformed Peiper's command into one of Germany's most effective combined arms formations. Panzer IV tanks provided direct fire support to suppress American defensive positions, while Panther tanks maneuvered to exploit weak points in the hastily prepared fortifications. SS Panzer Grenadiers, dismounting from their half-tracks under cover of the armoured assault, infiltrated American positions with automatic weapons and shaped charges that could eliminate strongpoints within minutes. The coordination between armour and infantry reflected years of combat experience and training that inexperienced American forces could not match. The collapse of Honsfeld's defences triggered a chain reaction that spread throughout the northern sector of the American line. Communications had been disrupted by German artillery, preventing effective coordination between isolated American units. Individual companies and battalions found themselves fighting independent battles without knowledge of the larger tactical situation or the ability to request support from adjacent units. German forces exploited this confusion by striking at the joints between American formations, creating gaps that could be widened into major breakthroughs. However, the 99th Infantry Division's resistance was far from broken. Elements of the division, particularly those positioned around Elsenborn Ridge, established defensive positions that would prove impossible for German forces to overcome. These positions, anchored on commanding terrain and supported by concentrated artillery fire, formed the northern shoulder of what would become known as the Bulge. The division's sacrifice in the initial days of the offensive would prevent German forces from widening their breakthrough and ultimately contribute to the failure of the entire operation. The German advance toward Büllingen revealed both the strengths and limitations of Paper's approach to armoured warfare. His willingness to bypass strong resistance and exploit weak points allowed rapid penetration of American defences, following established doctrine for mobile operations that prioritized speed over systematic reduction of enemy strongpoints. However, this approach also left isolated enemy positions in his rear that could threaten his supply lines and prevent follow-on forces from maintaining the pace of advance. American artillery, once it was properly coordinated, could devastate German formations that had outrun their supporting units. The capture of Büllingen provided German forces with their most significant logistical victory of the entire offensive. The town's fuel depot, established to support American armoured operations, contained over 50,000 gallons of gasoline that Piper's vehicles desperately needed. German forces had already consumed more fuel than planned, and their supply lines were becoming increasingly vulnerable to American counterattack. The captured fuel allowed Piper to continue his advance without waiting for German supply columns to negotiate the congested roads behind the front lines. However, the most significant missed opportunity of Piper's advance occurred just outside Stavelot, where German reconnaissance failed to detect a massive American fuel depot containing over 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. This enormous cache, virtually undefended and located within 500 meters of the main German axis of advance, could have supplied the entire 6th SS Panzer Army for weeks. The failure to discover and capture this depot reflected the tunnel vision that characterized Piper's command style. His focus on speed and breakthrough had blinded him to opportunities that could have transformed the strategic situation. The assault on Stavelot demonstrated the evolution of American resistance from initial shock to determined opposition. The town's defenders, elements of the 30th Infantry Division, including the 117th and 119th Infantry Regiments, had received word of the Malmedy massacre and understood that surrender was not an option when facing SS troops. They established defensive positions in stone buildings that could withstand direct tank fire, and they fought with a desperation that surprised German attackers accustomed to easy victories over demoralized opponents. The urban combat in Stavelot revealed the limitations of German armoured tactics when faced with determined resistance in built-up areas. Tank crews, trained for rapid movement across open terrain, struggled to identify and eliminate infantry positions concealed in cellars and upper floors of buildings. American defenders used bazookas and sticky bombs to attack German armour at close range, turning the town's narrow streets into death traps for vehicles that could not manoeuvre effectively. The battle consumed precious time and fuel while inflicting casualties that Piper's force could not afford. American engineers, following established defensive doctrine, had prepared key bridges and road junctions for demolition in case of German breakthrough. The bridge over the Amblev River represented a critical choke point that could delay or halt Piper's advance if properly defended. A small group of American engineers, led by Sergeant Charles Hensel, waited until German vehicles were crossing before detonating charges that sent the span tumbling into the icy water below. This act of heroism forced Piper to seek alternative routes and cost him additional time that he could not afford to lose. The destruction of the Amblev Bridge marked the beginning of the end for Piper's breakthrough attempt. Forced to detour through increasingly difficult terrain, his column became strung out over several kilometers and vulnerable to the kind of coordinated counterattack that American forces were beginning to organize. Allied air power, grounded for days by poor weather, finally managed to launch reconnaissance flights that identified the location and strength of German spearheads. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs began attacking Piper's vehicles wherever the forest canopy provided insufficient concealment. The psychological transformation of American forces during this phase of the battle was as significant as any tactical development. Soldiers who had initially panicked at the sight of German armour were learning to use terrain and prepared positions to neutralize enemy advantages. The knowledge that capture meant possible execution had eliminated the option of surrender and forced American units to fight with the same desperation that characterized German offensive operations. More importantly, American commanders were beginning to coordinate their responses effectively, concentrating artillery fire and positioning reserves to exploit German vulnerabilities. The village of Trois-Ponts became the furthest point of Piper's advance, a monument to both German audacity and the ultimate limits of elite formations operating without adequate support. His column had penetrated nearly 60 kilometers into Allied territory, inflicting severe casualties on American formations and creating panic throughout the Allied rear areas. However, the combination of fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and increasing American resistance had finally brought the SS Spearhead to a halt. The rampage that had begun with such promise was ending in isolation and vulnerability. As December 17th drew to a close, Kampfgruppe Peiper had achieved tactical successes that exceeded even optimistic German expectations. The deep penetration into Allied territory, the capture of vital fuel supplies, and the severe mauling of American defensive positions had demonstrated that German forces retained the capability for breakthrough operations. However, the costs of these achievements, in fuel consumed, casualties suffered, and strategic opportunities missed, had created problems that would prove insurmountable. The rampage was ending, but the reckoning had only begun. The news of the Malmedy massacre reached American frontline units through official channels and informal soldier networks with devastating psychological impact. Within hours of the first confirmed reports, a transformation began spreading through Allied ranks that would fundamentally alter the character of combat in the Ardennes. American soldiers, raised in a culture that emphasized fair play and adherence to rules, discovered that their enemies had abandoned the Geneva Convention that both sides had pledged to observe. The response to this revelation would test the moral foundations of the Allied cause and reveal uncomfortable truths about warfare under extreme conditions. The immediate reaction among American troops was a mixture of outrage, fear, and desire for revenge that military censors worked frantically to suppress from news reports reaching the home front. Soldiers who had previously taken German prisoners without incident now viewed every SS uniform as evidence of participation in war crimes. Infantry companies that had been fighting defensive actions with conventional tactics began adopting a more ruthless approach toward captured enemy personnel, particularly those from elite formations. The psychological barrier that separated civilized warfare from barbarism was beginning to crumble under the pressure of total war. Reports began reaching American headquarters of SS prisoners being shot while attempting to surrender or killed shortly after capture. These incidents, often dismissed as combat casualties or justified as necessary self-defense, represented the first signs that Allied forces were beginning to adopt the same disregard for international law that characterized their enemies. Individual soldiers, traumatized by reports of German atrocities and fearing for their own survival, made split-second decisions that reflected rage rather than military discipline. The moral complexity of the situation was compounded by contradictory guidance from American commanders, who were struggling to maintain military discipline while responding to legitimate concerns about prisoner safety. Official policy remained clear. Prisoners were to be treated according to international law regardless of enemy behavior. However, informal guidance suggested that soldiers should exercise extreme caution when dealing with SS personnel, and should prioritize their own survival over adherence to legal niceties. This ambiguity created conditions where individual soldiers would be forced to make moral decisions that their training had not prepared them to handle. The cycle of revenge and retaliation escalated throughout the final weeks of December as both sides committed additional atrocities that poisoned the psychological atmosphere of the campaign. German forces, increasingly desperate as their offensive stalled, murdered Belgian civilians, suspected of assisting Allied forces, and executed American prisoners who could not keep pace with retreating columns. American troops responded with their own acts of violence against German captives, creating a spiral of brutality that would culminate in the war's most documented instance of Allied war crimes. The massacre at Chinon occurred on January 1st, 1945, as American forces launched their counter-offensive to eliminate the German salient created during the Ardennes campaign. Elements of the 11th Armoured Division, advancing through the village after bitter fighting with German defenders, encountered approximately 60 Wehrmacht prisoners who had surrendered after their positions were overrun. These soldiers, members of Volksgrenadier and regular army units rather than SS formations, posed no threat to their captors and were fully entitled to protection under international law. What happened at Chinon would remain buried in official records for decades, surfacing only through the patient research of historians who were willing to examine uncomfortable aspects of Allied conduct during the war. The German prisoners were lined up in a field outside the village and machine-gunned by American troops who claimed they were responding to earlier atrocities committed against American personnel. Unlike Malmedy, where a few Americans managed to survive and testify about their experiences, there were no German survivors of Chinon to provide witness testimony about the massacre. The Chinon massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of escalating violence that characterized the final phase of the Ardennes campaign. American soldiers who had been indoctrinated with respect for enemy prisoners found themselves operating in an environment where survival seemed to depend on abandoning civilized restraints. The psychological impact of weeks of brutal fighting, combined with constant exposure to German atrocities, had created conditions where moral reasoning was overwhelmed by primitive desires for revenge and self-preservation. The participation of regular Wehrmacht units in atrocities previously associated only with SS formations revealed the extent to which Nazi ideology had penetrated German military culture. Soldiers who had once prided themselves on professional conduct began adopting the same attitudes toward enemy civilians and prisoners that characterized the most fanatical Nazi units. This transformation reflected both the desperation of Germany's strategic situation and the success of years of ideological indoctrination that portrayed the war as a struggle for racial survival rather than territorial control. American commanders faced an impossible dilemma as reports of war crimes by their own troops began reaching higher headquarters. Prosecuting soldiers for violations of international law would damage morale at a critical moment in the campaign and might encourage German forces to commit additional atrocities. However, ignoring clear evidence of war crimes would compromise the moral authority that distinguished Allied forces from their Nazi opponents and could establish dangerous precedents for future conflicts. The solution adopted by most commanders was willful blindness, avoiding investigations that might uncover inconvenient truths. The psychological impact of participating in or witnessing war crimes extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Soldiers who had enlisted to fight for democracy and human rights discovered that warfare could transform anyone into a killer who abandoned moral constraints under sufficient pressure. Some troops suffered psychological breakdowns that removed them from combat effectiveness, while others became increasingly brutalized and callous toward enemy suffering. The long-term consequences for individuals and society would not become apparent until veterans returned home and struggled to readjust to civilian life. The role of military justice in addressing war crimes committed by Allied forces revealed institutional weaknesses that reflected broader cultural attitudes toward military necessity. Investigating officers who attempted to document atrocities found their efforts discouraged by superior officers who preferred to focus on military objectives rather than moral complications. Evidence was lost or destroyed, witnesses were transferred to other units, and reports disappeared into filing systems where they would remain buried for decades. The cover-up was not the result of deliberate conspiracy, but rather institutional reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about Allied conduct. The delayed historical reckoning with Allied war crimes in the Ardennes began only in the 1980s, when historians gained access to previously classified documents and began interviewing surviving veterans who were finally willing to discuss their experiences. Researchers like Charles Whiting and Anthony Beaver documented incidents that had been suppressed or ignored by official histories, revealing that war crimes were not limited to Axis forces, but occurred on both sides whenever institutional restraints collapsed. This scholarship challenged comfortable narratives about the good war and forced a more nuanced understanding of moral behavior under extreme conditions. The moral legacy of the Ardennes campaign extends beyond the immediate participants to encompass broader questions about the nature of civilization and its vulnerability during total war. Soldiers from democratic societies, raised with respect for law and human dignity, proved capable of the same atrocities that characterized their totalitarian opponents when subjected to sufficient stress and provocation. The thin veneer of civilization that separates modern societies from barbarism was revealed to be more fragile than anyone had imagined, with implications that extended far beyond military history. The blood spilled in the snow of the Ardennes was not merely the product of military necessity, but reflected the moral corruption that accompanies warfare when it exceeds the bounds of civilized conduct. Both sides discovered that the line between heroism and atrocity could disappear under the pressure of combat, fear, and revenge. The lessons learned in those frozen Belgian forests would influence military doctrine and international law for decades to come, serving as a reminder that victory means little if it requires the abandonment of the values that make victory worthwhile. The strategic crossroads town of Saint-Vith stood like a fortress in the path of the German offensive, its cobblestone streets and medieval buildings serving as the last major obstacle between the advancing Wehrmacht and the open road to the Meuse River. This small Belgian community, home to fewer than 3,000 civilians, had suddenly become one of the most important pieces of real estate in Western Europe. Control of its road network would determine whether the German breakthrough could maintain momentum or would be forced into time-consuming detours through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes forests. The defence of Saint-Vith fell primarily to the 7th Armoured Division, a veteran formation that had fought with distinction since the Normandy landings, but was now facing the most severe test of its combat effectiveness. General Robert Hasbrouck, commanding the division, understood that his mission was not to hold the town indefinitely, but to delay German forces long enough for Allied reserves to organise an effective counterattack. However, the strategic importance of the position meant that every hour of delay could influence the outcome of the entire campaign. The German assault on Saint-Vith began in earnest during the early morning hours of December 18th, as elements of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division launched coordinated attacks against American defensive positions established in the hills and villages surrounding the town. These were not the elite SS formations that had spearheaded the initial breakthrough, but experienced Wehrmacht soldiers who understood combined arms warfare and were determined to prove that regular German forces could achieve results equal to those of their more celebrated counterparts. The fighting that followed would demonstrate that the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a contest between elite formations, but a struggle involving the entire German war machine. The initial German probes revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the American defensive position. Saint-Vith's location at the centre of a road network made it virtually impossible to bypass, forcing German commanders to commit significant resources to its capture. However, the same geography that made the town strategically valuable also made it difficult to defend, as German forces could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, while American defenders were forced to spread their limited resources across an extended perimeter in the surrounding countryside. American tank crews found themselves fighting defensive battles across rolling terrain that offered little natural protection against German anti-tank weapons. Sherman tanks, designed for rapid movement across open terrain, struggled to find concealed positions that could provide effective cover while maintaining fields of fire against advancing German forces. German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, though short-ranged, could destroy American armour when German infantry managed to infiltrate close to American positions under cover of artillery bombardment or poor visibility. The fighting intensified on December 19th as German forces committed additional units to the assault, including elements of the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division and supporting armour from the 9th SS Panzer Division and other formations operating in the sector. While heavy tanks like the King Tiger were primarily concentrated with the 6th SS Panzer Army further north, the Germans committed substantial numbers of Panzer IV tanks and assault guns that provided effective fire support for infantry attacks. The cumulative pressure of multiple German attacks began to tell on American defenders who had been fighting continuously for over 72 hours. The destruction of individual American tanks became a tragic pattern that repeated throughout the defensive battles as German anti-tank teams exploited their growing familiarity with American tactics and dispositions. Sherman tanks, attempting to support infantry positions or respond to German breakthroughs, found themselves engaged at ranges that favoured German weapons and tactics. Tank crews, who survived initial hits, often faced the choice between abandoning their vehicles or attempting to fight from increasingly untenable positions. The psychological impact of these losses was as significant as the material damage to American combat effectiveness. American infantry, fighting alongside their armored comrades, demonstrated the same stubborn determination that had characterized Allied resistance throughout the Ardennes campaign. Soldiers who had trained for mobile warfare learned defensive tactics while under fire, using prepared positions and natural obstacles to maximum advantage against German attacks. The fighting was intense and personal, with small unit actions determining the outcome of larger tactical situations as both sides struggled for control of key terrain features around the town. German forces demonstrated their continuing effectiveness in coordinated operations, using artillery barrages to suppress American positions before launching infantry and armor attacks designed to exploit weak points in the defensive line. Volksgrenadier divisions, while lacking the elite reputation of SS formations, retained the tactical competence and fighting spirit that had characterized German forces throughout the war. Their systematic approach to reducing American strongpoints reflected professional military skill rather than fanatical ideology. The civilian population of St. Vith found itself caught between opposing forces as German artillery bombardment targeted the town and surrounding areas to disrupt American communications and supply lines. Belgian families evacuated their homes when possible, seeking shelter in cellars and basements while the battle raged around them. Many civilians fled toward American lines, hoping to find safety behind Allied positions, while others remained in the town hoping that the fighting would pass quickly. By December 20th, American defensive positions had been compressed into an increasingly small area around St. Vith as German forces systematically eliminated outlying strongpoints and captured commanding terrain. Communication with higher headquarters became increasingly difficult as German artillery targeted radio positions and command posts, forcing American commanders to rely on runners and improvised communication methods. General Hasbrouck found himself commanding a force that was rapidly diminishing in both numbers and combat effectiveness, while facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The situation became critical on December 21st, as German forces intensified their pressure from multiple directions, while American ammunition supplies dwindled and reinforcements failed to arrive. Higher headquarters, recognizing that continued defense of St. Vith would result in the complete destruction of the 7th Armored Division, authorized withdrawal from the town during the night of December 21st to 22nd. This decision, while militarily sound, meant abandoning a position that had cost hundreds of American lives to defend. The withdrawal from St. Vith required careful coordination under extremely difficult conditions as American forces attempted to disengage from close contact with German forces while maintaining unit cohesion. Equipment that could not be moved was destroyed to prevent its capture, while wounded soldiers were evacuated using whatever transportation remained available. The operation demonstrated the professional competence of American forces, even under adverse conditions, though it could not disguise the strategic significance of losing such an important position. German forces entered the largely abandoned ruins of St. Vith on December 23rd, finding a town that had been devastated by days of artillery bombardment and the destruction that accompanied modern warfare. While German propaganda proclaimed a great victory, the reality was that the defense of St. Vith had consumed precious time and resources that the German offensive could not afford to lose. The delay had allowed Allied forces to strengthen their positions elsewhere and organize the counterattacks that would ultimately doom the entire German operation. The human cost of the St. Vith battles was significant for both sides. The 7th Armored Division, while not completely destroyed, suffered casualties that severely reduced its combat effectiveness and required extensive reorganization before it could return to active operations. German casualties, while lower than American losses, still represented a serious drain on resources that the Wehrmacht could not easily replace. More importantly, the time consumed in capturing St. Vith had allowed Allied forces to organize the resistance that would ultimately stop the German advance. The reaction of St. Vith's civilian population to German occupation revealed the complex ethnic and political divisions that characterized this border region between Germany and Belgium. Many residents, particularly those of German ancestry, welcomed the Wehrmacht as liberators rather than conquerors, displaying swastika flags and providing assistance to German forces. This collaboration reflected both genuine sympathy for Nazi ideology and practical considerations about survival under occupation. The enthusiasm would prove short-lived, as the realities of German military administration became apparent in the weeks that followed. German commanders celebrated the capture of St. Vith as proof that their forces retained the capability for decisive victory against Allied opposition. However, the resources consumed in taking the town had seriously weakened German offensive potential, just as the campaign reached its most critical phase. The road network was finally in German hands, but the forces available to exploit this opportunity were no longer adequate for the strategic objectives that Hitler had set for the operation. St. Vith had fallen, but its defense had achieved the strategic purpose for which so many American soldiers had fought and died. While German forces consolidated their control over St. Vith, an even more critical battle was developing around the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division found itself completely surrounded by German forces that seemed determined to eliminate this obstacle to their continued advance. Unlike St. Vith, which had fallen after determined resistance, Bastogne would become a symbol of American determination and the turning point that transformed the German offensive from potential breakthrough into inevitable defeat. The paratroopers who held this vital road junction would write one of the most inspiring chapters in American military history. The encirclement of Bastogne had developed gradually as German forces advanced on multiple axes during the first week of the offensive. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, had successfully penetrated American defenses and was advancing toward the Meuse River when intelligence reports identified Bastogne as a critical choke point that could not be bypassed. Every major road in the region passed through this small Belgian town, making its control essential for maintaining the supply lines that German success depended upon. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to Bastogne as part of the emergency response to the German breakthrough, arriving just hours before German forces completed their encirclement of the town. These veteran paratroopers, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had fought with distinction during the Normandy invasion and Operation Market Garden, but they now faced their most challenging assignment. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from normal supply lines, they would have to hold Bastogne against overwhelming odds while Allied forces organized a relief operation. The German forces surrounding Bastogne represented a formidable array of Wehrmacht units that demonstrated the continuing strength of the German military machine. Elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and Panzer Lehr Division had established blocking positions on all roads leading to the town, while artillery units positioned in the surrounding hills could deliver concentrated fire on targets within the defensive perimeter. German commanders were confident that the isolated American garrison would surrender within days rather than face destruction. The initial German attacks on Bastogne's perimeter revealed both the strengths and limitations of airborne forces fighting in defensive positions. Paratroopers, trained for rapid movement and aggressive assault operations, adapted quickly to the requirements of static defense while maintaining the unit cohesion that distinguished elite formations from ordinary infantry. However, their light weapons and limited anti-tank capabilities made it difficult to repel sustained attacks by German armor, forcing American commanders to rely on improvised tactics and careful positioning of their scarce resources. The weather conditions that had favored German forces during the opening phase of the offensive now became a critical factor in Bastogn's survival. Heavy cloud cover and intermittent snow continued to ground Allied air power, preventing the kind of close air support that had characterized previous American defensive operations. However, the same weather that protected German forces from air attack also prevented effective aerial reconnaissance, allowing American defenders to conceal their positions and surprise German attackers with carefully planned defensive fires. The supply situation inside Bastogne grew increasingly desperate as German forces tightened their siege and prevented any ground resupply of the surrounded garrison. American troops were forced to ration ammunition, food, and medical supplies while maintaining continuous vigilance against German attacks that could come from any direction. The wounded accumulated in improvised aid stations, where medical personnel struggled to provide adequate care without proper facilities or sufficient supplies. Morale remained high despite these hardships, sustained by confidence in eventual relief and determination to uphold the reputation of airborne forces. The breakthrough in weather conditions on December 23rd provided the first opportunity for Allied air power to intervene in the siege of Bastogne. Clear skies allowed C-47 Dakota transport aircraft to attempt supply drops to the surrounded garrison, braving intense German anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the desperate defenders. The sight of Allied aircraft overhead provided an enormous psychological boost to American troops who had begun to wonder if they had been forgotten by higher headquarters. The supply drops that followed, while including some comfort items like cigarettes and chocolate among the essential military supplies, were primarily focused on ammunition, medical equipment, and food necessary for continued resistance. Each successful drop represented a triumph of Allied logistics and pilot courage, as transport crews flew through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver supplies that meant the difference between continued resistance and inevitable surrender. The operation demonstrated Allied capabilities while providing tangible evidence that relief operations were being organized. German commanders, recognizing that time was working against their broader strategic objectives, decided to demand the surrender of Bastogne's garrison rather than continue costly assault operations. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a flag of truce, carrying an ultimatum that demanded immediate capitulation to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The message, drafted in formal military language, warned that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of the American force and threatened dire consequences for the civilian population of Bastogne. General McAuliffe's response to the German surrender demand became one of the most famous utterances in American military history. His single-word reply, "nuts," captured both the defiant spirit of the American garrison and the informal leadership style that had made airborne units so effective throughout the war. The response was written on paper and delivered to astonished German officers by Colonel Joseph Harper, making it clear that Bastogne's defenders had no intention of surrendering regardless of the consequences. The incident boosted American morale while demonstrating to German forces that their psychological warfare tactics had failed completely. Daily life under siege in Bastogne tested the endurance and resourcefulness of both military personnel and civilian inhabitants who found themselves trapped in the combat zone. American soldiers established defensive positions in cellars, shops, and private homes, while Belgian civilians huddled in improvised shelters, hoping to survive the artillery bombardment that accompanied German attacks on military positions. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants became blurred as German shells aimed at American defensive positions inevitably struck civilian areas in the densely packed town. The medical situation inside Bastogne became increasingly critical as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. American medics and surgeons worked in converted buildings without adequate lighting, heating, or surgical instruments, while treating wounds that would have challenged the resources of fully equipped hospitals. Belgian civilians, despite the dangers they faced, volunteered to assist with medical care and other support functions, demonstrating the kind of civilian-military cooperation that characterized the best aspects of Allied operations. German artillery bombardment of Bastogne followed patterns that reflected military necessity rather than deliberate terrorism, though the effects on civilians were devastating nonetheless. German gunners targeted American defensive positions, command posts, and supply areas, but the confined nature of the town meant that civilian areas were inevitably struck by shells intended for military targets. The German artillery units, positioned in concealed locations throughout the surrounding hills, could deliver accurate fire while remaining largely immune to American counter-battery fire due to limited ammunition supplies within the perimeter. German propaganda efforts included leaflets dropped into the American lines that attempted to convince defenders that resistance was futile and that surrender would bring fair treatment. These psychological warfare operations emphasized the hopelessness of the military situation and promised that prisoners would be treated according to international law. However, news of the Malmedy massacre had already reached Bastogne's defenders, making them skeptical of German promises and more determined to fight to the end rather than risk capture. The approaching relief operation, organized by General Patton's Third Army, provided hope for Bastogne's defenders while creating additional pressure on German forces that were already struggling to maintain their offensive momentum. Radio communications between the surrounded garrison and relief forces, though intermittent and subject to German interference, confirmed that major Allied forces were advancing toward Bastogne from the south. This knowledge sustained American morale during the most difficult period of the siege, while forcing German commanders to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations. The performance of the 101st Airborne Division during the siege of Bastogne demonstrated that elite American forces, when properly led and motivated, could hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds. The paratroopers' ability to adapt their training and tactics to unfamiliar defensive missions while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress validated the investment in elite formations and specialized training. More importantly, their resistance consumed German time and resources at precisely the moment when rapid advance towards strategic objectives was most critical to overall German success. As December drew to a close, the siege of Bastogne had become a symbol that transcended its immediate military significance. American forces had demonstrated that determined resistance could neutralize superior numbers and firepower when supported by effective leadership and adequate supply. The defense of Bastogne had also revealed the limitations of German offensive capabilities when faced with organized opposition rather than surprised and unprepared defenders. The fortress under siege had become the rock upon which German ambitions would ultimately founder, proving that elite forces properly employed could achieve strategic results far beyond their numerical strength. The conference that would change the course of the Battle of the Bulge convened at 10:30 in the morning of December 19th, 1944, in the ancient French fortress city of Verdun, where Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had summoned his senior commanders to address the crisis developing in the Ardennes. What followed would become one of the most remarkable demonstrations of American military flexibility and the aggressive leadership that made General George S. Patton one of the war's most effective commanders. Eisenhower's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct. German forces had achieved tactical surprise and were threatening to split the Allied front in half, potentially isolating British forces in the north while disrupting the entire Allied offensive capability in Western Europe. Most critically, the surrounded garrison at Bastogne needed relief within days or faced complete destruction. Patton's response stunned the assembled commanders. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours," he declared without hesitation, a promise that seemed impossible given the logistical complexities involved in reorienting an entire army from one axis of advance to another. However, Patton's confidence was based on contingency planning that he had begun even before the German offensive commenced, recognizing that enemy action in the Ardennes might require rapid response from his forces. The Third Army that Patton commanded represented one of the finest examples of American military organization in 1944. Over 250,000 men, organized into 9 divisions, had been engaged in aggressive operations against the Siegfried Line for weeks, achieving steady progress despite determined German resistance. These formations possessed the combat experience and leadership quality necessary for complex military operations, but they had never attempted anything as ambitious as a complete change of direction while maintaining offensive momentum. The geographical challenges were staggering. The Third Army's current positions faced east toward the Saar region, while the crisis required movement northward across difficult terrain during the worst winter weather in decades. Hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles would have to be moved over roads already congested with military traffic and supply convoys. Patton's Chief of Staff, Colonel Paul Harkins, immediately began the detailed planning that would transform Patton's bold promise into reality. 3 divisions, the 4th Armoured, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, would spearhead the relief operation. Each unit received specific movement orders and supply priorities to prevent traffic congestion that could paralyze the entire operation. The staff work demonstrated the organizational maturity that American forces had achieved after 2.5 years of combat experience. The logistical challenges extended far beyond simple movement of personnel and equipment. Ammunition supplies configured for attacks against fortified positions had to be redistributed for mobile operations. Fuel requirements would increase dramatically as vehicles consumed gasoline at unprecedented rates during rapid movement over difficult terrain. Medical facilities needed repositioning to support troops fighting in unfamiliar territory. The weather conditions that had favored German operations became a critical factor in American planning. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and persistent cloud cover continued to ground most Allied aircraft, preventing the close air support that had become routine in previous operations. However, the same weather that limited air operations also provided concealment from German reconnaissance, allowing Patton's forces to achieve tactical surprise. German intelligence officers initially dismissed reports of large-scale American redeployment as impossible given the logistical constraints involved. Wehrmacht planners had calculated that Allied forces would require weeks to organize effective counterattacks, providing sufficient time for German forces to reach their strategic objectives. The possibility that an entire American army could change direction and launch coordinated attacks within 48 hours seemed beyond Allied capabilities. The movement began during the early morning hours of December 20th, as lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division started their march northward. Column after column of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles moved through the darkness, their movement carefully coordinated to prevent traffic jams. Military police established traffic control points, while engineer units cleared snow and ice from nearly impassable roads. Communication with the beleaguered garrison at Bastogne remained intermittent and subject to German interference, but enough information reached Third Army headquarters to confirm that time was running out. Reports of dwindling ammunition supplies, mounting casualties, and increasing German pressure made it clear that relief operations had to succeed quickly. This knowledge drove Patton's staff to push their troops harder and accept risks that more cautious commanders might have avoided. The coordination between military branches faced significant limitations due to weather conditions that persisted until December 23rd. Fighter bombers remained grounded, leaving ground forces without close air support. This meant that American forces would have to achieve their objectives through superior ground tactics, rather than the combined arms dominance that had characterized previous successful operations. As December 21st dawned, Patton's lead elements were approaching their assembly areas while the remainder of the Third Army continued northward. The general himself moved forward to establish advanced headquarters closer to the developing battle, characteristically positioning himself where he could directly influence tactical operations. His presence provided psychological reassurance to troops about to engage in some of the most difficult fighting of their military careers. The transformation of the Third Army represented more than simple tactical reorientation. It demonstrated the operational maturity that American forces had achieved through combat experience and leadership development. Most importantly, it revealed that Allied forces had finally developed the flexibility that would allow them to compete with German military excellence on equal terms. Patton's thunderbolt was about to strike when the actual assault began on December 22nd. The first serious contact between Patton's advancing forces and German defensive positions occurred during the pre-dawn hours of December 22nd, when lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division encountered entrenched German troops near the villages of Bigonville and Warnach, blocking the most direct approaches to besieged Bastogne. This initial engagement established the pattern for brutal fighting that would characterize the Third Army's drive to relieve the surrounded garrison. German forces defending the approaches to Bastogne represented some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced formations, including elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and Panzer-Lehr Division that had been specifically positioned to prevent Allied relief efforts. These troops occupied carefully prepared defensive positions that took advantage of broken terrain and the limited road network characterizing the Ardennes region. German commanders understood that preventing American relief of Bastogne was as important as capturing the town itself. The tactical challenge facing American forces was complicated by terrain that favored defensive operations while limiting the mobility that constituted their primary advantage. Narrow roads, winding through steep hills and dense forests, could be blocked by small German forces armed with anti-tank weapons, forcing American columns to deploy into attack formations under direct enemy fire. The continuing winter weather that kept Allied air power grounded meant that ground forces would fight without tactical aviation support. The fighting around Warnach demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of American armoured tactics when faced with prepared German defences. Sherman tanks advancing in column formation along restricted roads became vulnerable to German anti-tank fire from concealed positions that were difficult to locate and suppress. American tank crews learned to coordinate their movements with infantry attacks designed to eliminate German strongpoints. But this process consumed time that the besieged garrison could not afford to lose. German defensive tactics reflected lessons learned during years of fighting against Allied forces that possessed superior numbers and firepower. Small units, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, would allow American columns to approach within effective range before opening fire from multiple positions simultaneously. This coordinated engagement would destroy or disable lead vehicles, blocking roads, and forcing American forces to to deploy under fire while German artillery observers cooled down accurate bombardment. American artillery played a crucial role in reducing German strongpoints that could not be eliminated by direct assault. Forward observers advancing with lead infantry elements identified German positions and called down concentrated fire that could devastate enemy defenses within minutes. The flexibility and responsiveness of American artillery systems allowed rapid shifts of fire from one target to another, supporting multiple attacks simultaneously. The breakthrough at Warnach came during the afternoon of December 23rd, when American forces finally overwhelmed the German defenders through coordinated assault and flanking maneuvers. The cost in casualties was significant for both sides, but American losses could be replaced while German casualties represented irreplaceable veterans. More importantly, the success opened one of the key approaches toward Bastogne and demonstrated that German defenses could not indefinitely delay determined American attacks. The village of Chaumont became the next major obstacle as German forces established new defensive positions. The fighting that developed demonstrated the evolving tactical competence of American forces as they learned to coordinate complex attacks under difficult conditions. Tank infantry teams, supported by concentrated artillery fire, systematically reduced German strongpoints, while engineer units cleared obstacles and maintained supply routes. German commanders attempted to organize counterattacks designed to disrupt American momentum and buy additional time. These counterattacks involved both Panzer IV tanks and the more formidable Panther tanks that Panzer Lehr divisions still possessed, demonstrating that German armoured forces retained significant combat capability. The tank battles that resulted were fierce but brief, as American numerical superiority and artillery support gradually overcame German tactical advantages. The weather conditions continued to influence tactical operations as both sides struggled with snow, ice, and limited visibility that made coordination difficult and movement dangerous. Tank crews found their vehicles' mobility severely limited by icy roads that could send multi-ton vehicles sliding into ditches with fatal consequences. Infantry soldiers fighting in temperatures well below freezing suffered from frostbite and exposure that reduced combat effectiveness. The weather finally began to clear on December 23rd, allowing Allied air power to intervene in the ground battle for the first time since the German offensive began. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs attacked German positions and supply lines while providing close air support to advancing American ground forces. The psychological impact of renewed air operations was enormous for both sides. The first radio contact between Patton's relief force and the defenders of Bastogne occurred during the evening of December 24th. The message was brief but electrifying. Relief force approaching from south. Hold fast. Patton coming. The psychological impact was enormous for both the relieving force and the besieged defenders, confirming that the relief operation was succeeding. German forces, monitoring American radio communications, understood that time was running out for their own efforts to capture Bastogne before relief arrived. Desperate attacks against the perimeter were launched with increasing frequency but decreasing effectiveness, as German commanders committed their remaining reserves in futile attempts to achieve victory. These final German assaults lacked the coordination necessary to break through defensive positions that had withstood a week of siege operations. The tactical competence that had made Patton one of America's most effective commanders was evident in his handling of the relief operation, as he balanced speed against caution and aggressive action against tactical prudence. His personal visits to forward units provided inspiration, while his staff coordination ensured that logistics kept pace with operational demands. Most importantly, his intuitive understanding of German defensive psychology allowed him to exploit enemy weaknesses while avoiding costly frontal assaults. As December 25th dawned, American forces were within striking distance of Baston's perimeter, while German defenders prepared for what they knew might be their final opportunity to prevent the relief operation from succeeding. The ring around Bastogne was weakening under sustained American pressure, but it had not yet been broken. The decisive moment of the entire Ardennes campaign was approaching. The moment that broke the siege of Bastogne came at 4:45 in the afternoon of December 26, 1944, when tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, finally smashed through the last German defensive positions near the village of Assenois and established physical contact with the perimeter held by the 101st Airborne Division. Lieutenant Charles Bogues, commanding the lead Sherman tank, became the first member of the relief force to shake hands with Bastogne's defenders, marking the end of a siege that had captured the attention of the entire Allied world. The breakthrough had been preceded by 4 days of intense fighting that tested the limits of both American and German forces. German forces defending the approaches to Bastogne fought with the desperation of troops who understood that failure meant strategic disaster for the entire Ardennes offensive. Every village and road junction became the scene of determined combat, as American forces gradually wore down German resistance through superior firepower and relentless pressure. The final assault that opened the corridor to Bastogne demonstrated the tactical maturity that American forces had achieved through combat experience and effective leadership. Coordinated attacks by armour, infantry, and artillery overwhelmed German strongpoints that had been holding up American advance for days, while supporting units moved quickly to exploit success and prevent German counterattacks. The operation required precise timing and careful coordination between multiple units operating under extremely difficult conditions. The emotional impact of the relief was overwhelming for both the rescued garrison and their relievers. Paratroopers, who had endured a week of siege conditions, fighting on reduced rations and dwindling ammunition supplies, suddenly found themselves reinforced by fresh troops equipped with abundant supplies. Tank crews and infantrymen of the 4th Armoured Division were greeted as heroes by defenders who had begun to wonder if help would ever arrive. However, the establishment of contact between relief forces and Bastogne's garrison represented only the beginning of a new phase in the battle, rather than its conclusion. The corridor opened by American forces was initially narrow and required careful protection, though German forces would never succeed in completely severing the connection once it was established. German commanders committed additional reserves to operations aimed at disrupting the American supply line, recognizing that loss of Bastogne would seriously compromise their entire offensive. The logistical challenges of supplying Bastogne through the newly opened corridor tested American organizational capabilities, while demonstrating the superiority of Allied supply systems. Supply convoys could now traverse roads that, while subject to German observation and occasional artillery fire, provided reliable access to the town for the first time since the siege began. Medical evacuation of wounded personnel from both the original garrison and the relief forces could now be met through normal procedures rather than dangerous airdrops. German artillery positioned in the hills surrounding Bastogne continued to pose a threat, though this was gradually reduced as American forces expanded their perimeter. Enemy observers could still call down accurate fire on targets within range, but American counter-battery operations, now supported by improved supply lines and reinforced artillery units, began systematic elimination of German gun positions. The expansion of the American perimeter around Bastogne proceeded systematically as additional Third Army units arrived and took over sectors from exhausted paratroopers who had been fighting continuously for over a week. The 101st Airborne Division was gradually reinforced and resupplied to the point where limited offensive operations became possible. Fresh units began planning attacks designed to push German forces back from the immediate vicinity of the town. German counterattacks aimed at recapturing Bastogne would continue intermittently from December 27th through early January 1945, demonstrating that enemy forces retained significant combat capability despite their failure to achieve strategic objectives. The most serious of these counterattacks would come during the New Year period, when German forces made their final, desperate attempts to salvage something from the failed Ardennes offensive. The civilian population of Bastogne found their immediate ordeal ending even though normal life remained impossible for weeks to come. German artillery could no longer terrorize the town at will, and essential supplies could now reach civilians who had been surviving on emergency rations. The relief had ended the immediate threat of capture, but had not yet restored peace to the battered community. The strategic significance of Bastogne's relief extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass the broader German offensive that had begun with such promise 10 days earlier. The failure to capture this vital road junction had disrupted German supply lines and prevented the rapid advance toward the Meuse River that Operation Watch on the Rhine depended upon. More importantly, the successful relief operation demonstrated that American forces had developed the operational flexibility necessary to respond effectively to German offensive operations. Patton's personal involvement in the relief operation had provided the kind of inspirational leadership that distinguished exceptional commanders from merely competent ones. His ability to coordinate complex military operations while maintaining the aggressive spirit that characterized successful offensive operations demonstrated why he was considered one of America's finest tactical commanders. The relief of Bastogne validated Patton's approach to warfare, while providing a model for future operations. The media attention focused on Bastogne's relief transformed a tactical operation into a symbol of American determination that resonated throughout the Allied world. The story of the surrounded paratroopers who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds captured public imagination and provided evidence that American forces could match German military excellence. As December 26th drew to a close, the relief of Bastogne marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge that would influence all subsequent operations. German forces had lost their best opportunity to achieve strategic success in the West, while American forces had demonstrated capabilities that impressed even their own commanders. The siege was broken, but the war in the Ardennes was far from over. Patton's thunderbolt had struck with devastating effect, but the storm would continue to rage across the frozen battlefields of Belgium for weeks to come. December 24th, 1944, dawned crisp and clear over the Ardennes battlefield for the first time since the German offensive began 8 days earlier. The persistent cloud cover and winter storms that had grounded Allied air power and allowed German forces to maneuver freely suddenly gave way to brilliant blue skies that would transform the entire character of the campaign. As Allied pilots across Belgium, France, and England received their mission briefings that Christmas Eve morning, they understood they were about to unleash the most devastating air assault of the European war. The meteorological transformation could not have come at a worse moment for German forces. Their supply lines, stretched thin across the difficult terrain of the Ardennes, had been operating in relative safety from air attack throughout the opening phase of the offensive. Thousands of vehicles carrying ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements had moved freely along the narrow roads, protected by the same weather that had enabled their initial breakthrough. That protection was about to disappear with catastrophic consequences. The Allied air armada that took flight on Christmas Eve represented the culmination of 3 years of strategic bombing development and tactical air power evolution. Over 2,000 aircraft from the Royal Air Force, United States Army Air Forces, and supporting allied nations launched coordinated attacks that covered every aspect of the German war machine operating in the Ardennes sector. Fighter bombers, medium bombers, and escort fighters worked in carefully orchestrated waves that maintained constant pressure on German positions throughout the daylight hours. The P-51 Mustangs that spearheaded the Allied air offensive demonstrated why they had become the dominant fighter aircraft of the European theatre. These long-range fighters proved equally effective in the tactical role of ground attack and air superiority. Their speed, maneuverability, and firepower allowed them to engage any German aircraft that attempted to contest Allied operations while simultaneously attacking ground targets with devastating effectiveness. German forces attempting to respond to the renewed Allied air threat discovered that the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of meaningful resistance. The few German fighters that managed to take off faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage against Allied formations that could commit hundreds of aircraft to individual missions. More critically, the German pilots who remained operational lacked the training and experience that had characterized the Luftwaffe in its prime. The systematic destruction of German supply lines began within hours of the weather clearing and continued with methodical precision throughout the final week of December. Allied pilots, guided by detailed intelligence about German logistical operations, targeted fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and vehicle concentrations with devastating accuracy. The narrow roads that had facilitated German advance now became death traps where disabled vehicles created bottlenecks that exposed entire convoys to air attack. P-47 Thunderbolts demonstrated their devastating ground attack capabilities against German armoured formations that could no longer hide under cloud cover. These rugged aircraft, carrying rockets, bombs, and heavy machine guns, could destroy tanks and other armoured vehicles with precision strikes that German air defences were powerless to prevent. The psychological impact on German ground troops was as significant as the material damage. The fuel shortage that had plagued German operations since the beginning of the offensive became critical, as Allied air attacks destroyed the supply convoys carrying precious gasoline to forward units. Tanks and other armoured vehicles that had spearheaded the German breakthrough found themselves immobilized not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks that could not be refilled. Piper's isolated column was forced to abandon most of its heavy equipment when continued advance became impossible without adequate fuel reserves. The coordination between Allied air and ground forces reached new levels of effectiveness as weather conditions allowed close air support that had been impossible during the opening phase of the German offensive. Forward air controllers could direct fighter bombers against specific German positions within minutes of identification. This responsive air support eliminated many of the defensive advantages that German forces had exploited during the early fighting. The few Luftwaffe units that attempted to contest Allied air superiority suffered devastating losses that eliminated their remaining combat effectiveness. Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Fokker-Wulf 190 fighters could not compete against Allied formations that possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and pilot quality advantages. The Me-262 jet fighters were too few in number and too unreliable mechanically to influence the outcome of air battles. By December 31st, the transformation of the Ardennes battlefield was complete and irreversible. German forces that had achieved their greatest success in over a year found themselves trapped in a salient that had become indefensible under constant air attack. The initiative had passed permanently to Allied forces that could now coordinate air and ground operations with devastating effectiveness. The weather had indeed changed everything, and with it, the fate of Hitler's last gamble in the West. As 1944 drew to a close, Adolf Hitler and his remaining Air Force commanders conceived one final desperate gamble that would demonstrate both the continuing audacity and ultimate futility of German military planning. Operation Bodenplatte would attempt to achieve through surprise what the Luftwaffe could no longer accomplish through sustained operations. On New Year's Day 1945, nearly 1,000 German aircraft would launch the largest air operation mounted by the Luftwaffe since the Battle of Britain. The planning for Operation Bodenplatte reflected both German operational competence and the strategic delusions that characterized Nazi leadership in the war's final phase. Luftwaffe commanders understood that their remaining aircraft and pilots represented the last reserves of German air power, but they also recognized that these forces were being systematically destroyed through piecemeal commitment to defensive operations. The choice was between gradual annihilation through attrition or the possibility of achieving decisive results through concentrated attack. German intelligence had identified 27 Allied airfields within range of available Luftwaffe forces, each supporting the tactical air operations that were systematically destroying German ground forces throughout the Ardennes salient. These bases possessed minimal defensive preparations and relied primarily on fighter patrols rather than anti-aircraft guns for protection. Allied commanders had grown complacent about the possibility of large-scale German air attack. The execution of Operation Bodenplatte demonstrated both the continuing technical competence of German aircrew and the fundamental weakness of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. Navigation errors caused by inadequate training resulted in several German formations attacking the wrong targets or failing to locate their assigned objectives entirely. Most critically, the operation consumed fuel reserves that German forces could not replace, regardless of its tactical results. The surprise achieved by German forces at several Allied airfields was complete and devastating. At Eindhoven, German fighters and fighter bombers destroyed over 100 Allied aircraft on the ground, while suffering minimal losses to defensive fire. Similar attacks at other airfields eliminated dozens of American and British aircraft that had been parked with minimal dispersal or protective revetments. However, the tactical success of individual attacks could not disguise the strategic catastrophe that Operation Bodenplatte represented for German air power. The Luftwaffe committed over 900 aircraft to the operation and lost approximately 300, including many of its most experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Allied losses, while significant in absolute numbers, represented aircraft and aircrew that could be replaced within weeks through massive production and training programs. Allied response to the German air attack demonstrated the resilience and depth of resources that characterized the Anglo-American war effort. Damaged airfields were repaired within days, replacement aircraft arrived from production centers, and new pilots fresh from training schools took over the missions of those killed or captured. By January 5th, Allied air operations had resumed at full intensity, while German air power remained effectively neutralized. The failure of Operation Bodenplatte to achieve lasting results marked the end of the Luftwaffe as an effective military force and confirmed Allied air supremacy over all theatres of operation. German commanders discovered that concentrated air attack could not overcome Allied defences and reserve capacity. The last gasp of German air power had failed, leaving Wehrmacht ground forces to face the remainder of the war without any hope of air support. As January 1945 progressed, the consequences became apparent in every aspect of German military operations. Ground forces operating without air cover found themselves blind to Allied movements while remaining constantly vulnerable to air attack. The psychological effect on German troops was profound, as soldiers understood that they faced the remainder of the war without the air support that had once given German forces their decisive advantage. The order that sealed the fate of Germany's last major offensive in the West came from Adolf Hitler's headquarters on January 8, 1945, when the Führer finally acknowledged what his field commanders had understood for days. Operation Watch on the Rhine had failed completely. The systematic withdrawal that followed would demonstrate both the continuing tactical competence of German forces and the ultimate futility of Hitler's strategic vision. The retreat to the Reich had begun. The German withdrawal from the Ardennes salient proceeded according to carefully prepared plans that reflected the professional competence of Wehrmacht staff officers, despite the strategic failure of their political leadership. Units that had penetrated deepest into Allied territory began their retirement first, followed by formations that held less exposed positions. However, tactical skill could not overcome the fundamental problems of fuel shortage, air supremacy, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. Allied commanders launched coordinated counteroffensives designed to trap retreating Wehrmacht forces before they could reach the security of their border fortifications. General Patton's Third Army advanced northward from Bastogne, while British and American forces struck southward. The goal was to cut off German escape routes and force the surrender or destruction of enemy formations that had invested Hitler's last strategic reserves in the failed Ardennes gamble. The recapture of key towns throughout the Ardennes became symbols of Allied success and German failure. Houffalize fell on January 16th after brief but intense fighting. Saint-Vith, the crossroads town that had cost so many lives to defend and capture, returned to Allied control on January 23rd as Wehrmacht forces abandoned positions they could no longer supply or reinforce. The human cost of Hitler's Ardennes gamble became apparent as casualty reports reached both German and Allied headquarters. German losses totaled approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, representing formations that could not be replaced. American casualties exceeded 89,000, making the Battle of the Bulge the costliest engagement fought by United States forces during the entire European campaign. The material losses suffered by German forces were equally devastating. Over 800 tanks and assault guns were lost during the operation, representing armoured vehicles that German industry could no longer produce in adequate numbers. Fuel consumption during the offensive exceeded German reserves and seriously compromised Wehrmacht capabilities in all theatres. The final German positions in the Ardennes were abandoned on January 28, 1945, as Wehrmacht forces completed their withdrawal to the Siegfried Line fortifications. The salient that had once threatened to split Allied forces in half had been completely eliminated, leaving German forces in defensive positions that were weaker than they had been before the offensive began. Hitler's last gamble had achieved nothing except the destruction of Germany's ability to conduct further offensive operations. The strategic consequences of the Ardennes campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Wehrmacht reserves that might have been used to defend against Soviet offensives in the east had been consumed in the futile attempt to achieve decisive results in the west. The failure convinced Allied leaders that German resistance was weakening and that aggressive operations could achieve decisive results with acceptable casualties. As February 1945 began, the Ardennes battlefield returned to the relative quiet that had characterized the sector before Hitler's desperate gamble. The snow that had witnessed so much suffering began to melt, revealing the debris of battle that would serve as monuments to both German ambition and Allied determination. Hitler's last gamble had ended in complete failure, bringing the Third Reich measurably closer to the total defeat that would come just 3 months later. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when Allied forces restored their original front lines and the last German units withdrew to the positions they had held before Hitler launched his desperate gamble 6 weeks earlier. Behind them lay a snow-covered battlefield that had witnessed some of the most brutal fighting in Western Europe, leaving scars on the landscape and in human memory that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The final reckoning of this massive clash would reveal both the terrible cost of modern warfare and the decisive shift in military capability that doomed the Third Reich. The human toll of Hitler's Ardennes offensive was staggering by any measure. German casualties totaled approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, representing around a fifth of the 450,000 forces committed to the operation. These losses included some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, whose deaths weakened German military effectiveness far beyond their numbers. American casualties reached 89,000, making the Battle of the Bulge the costliest single engagement fought by United States forces during the entire European campaign, while British casualties added several thousand more to the Allied total. The material losses were equally devastating for German forces that could no longer replace equipment at the rate it was being destroyed. Over 800 tanks and assault guns were lost during the operation, along with countless trucks, artillery pieces, and other essential equipment. More critically, fuel consumption during the offensive exceeded Germany's strategic reserves and left Wehrmacht forces throughout Europe operating on critically reduced mobility. The Luftwaffe's destruction during Operation Bodenplatte eliminated German air power as an effective factor in military operations, leaving ground forces defenseless against Allied air attack. The strategic impact of the Ardennes campaign on the war's final months was profound and irreversible. Wehrmacht reserves that might have been used to defend against Soviet winter offensives in the east had been consumed in the futile attempt to achieve decisive results in the west. When Stalin's forces launched their final drive toward Berlin in January 1945, German commanders discovered that they lacked the mobile reserves necessary to contain breakthrough operations or conduct effective counterattacks. The Ardennes offensive had not changed the course of the war, but had accelerated Germany's collapse by months. The reputations forged during the Battle of the Bulge would define how history remembered its key commanders. Joachim Paper emerged as the embodiment of SS, tactical brilliance, corrupted by ideological extremism and criminal conduct. His deep penetration into Allied lines demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of German armoured tactics, while the massacre at Malmedy revealed the moral bankruptcy of Nazi military culture. Paper's ultimate fate, trapped, surrounded, and forced to abandon his equipment while escaping on foot, symbolized the broader German experience during the campaign. George S. Patton's reputation was enhanced by his army's rapid response to the crisis, though the successful defense of Bastogne belonged primarily to the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units who held the vital crossroads against overwhelming odds. Patton's 90-degree pivot of an entire army and subsequent drive through German defensive lines demonstrated the operational flexibility that characterized American military effectiveness in its mature phase. His relief of Bastogne provided the dramatic climax to a defense that had already proven Allied resilience and determination. The clash between elite German and American forces represented the broader struggle between totalitarian aggression and democratic resistance that defined the war's moral character. However, the reality of combat was often more immediate and personal than ideological, as soldiers on both sides fought primarily for their units, their comrades, and their own survival, rather than abstract political principles. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that tactical excellence and individual courage, while necessary, could not overcome the fundamental weaknesses of a political system that had exhausted its human and material resources. The battle's place in military history extends beyond its immediate strategic results to encompass broader lessons about modern warfare and the relationship between technology, leadership, and national will. The Ardennes campaign proved that even elite forces operating with tactical surprise could not achieve decisive results without adequate logistical support and air superiority. It demonstrated the crucial importance of weather and terrain in military operations, while revealing the limits of individual heroism against overwhelming material disadvantage. In popular memory, the Battle of the Bulge has become synonymous with American resilience and the triumph of democratic values over totalitarian aggression. The surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, the heroic engineers who destroyed bridges under fire, and the tank crews who fought through blizzards have become enduring symbols of courage under extreme adversity. Their sacrifice ensured that Hitler's last gamble would fail, and that the war in Europe would end with the complete defeat of Nazi Germany, rather than the negotiated settlement that German leadership had desperately sought.